Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast. Bring you energy matters in an informal setting. After a short summer break, we are back. And this week, we'll turn our attention back to France. And announcements by the country's grid operator, RTE, to restrict or curb electricity exports to its neighbours. What are the reasons for the limitations? How much power has RTE cut? And what has been the impact on France's neighbours and the market more generally? Are the curbs an indication of the future of increased rollout of renewable energy and the pressure that poses onto the power network, not only in France, but beyond? Helping me, Richard Sverrisson, to shed light on this contentious issue are Frank Boerman of Tennet. A warm welcome.
Thank you.
Clement Boilloux of Montel Analytics. Bonjour, ça va, Clement?
Hello, Richard.
And welcome back, Muriel Boselli, France correspondent for Montel News.
Hello, Richard.
I'd like to start with some context. This week, Montel Analytics issued a report and about power flows within Europe. Clement, could you give us some of your findings there, and where does it place France in terms of electricity imports and exports?
Well, France remained the first exporter all over Europe, a bit more than 40 terawatt-hour per year for the first semester. We witnessed that it's mainly due to the nuclear level and also high hydropower production. That is quite likely be the case for the next semester also, just because the nuclear production is continuing to rise. The target of EDF should be achieved in the highest part of the objective, above the 350 terawatt-hour. So, yeah, France will remain also exporter for the next semester.
So even though we've seen some of these restrictions in place in terms of France's electricity exports, France is still the powerhouse here in Europe, isn't it? It's really generating a lot of electricity that it needs to export abroad.
Yes, absolutely. France is absolutely in oversupply, and due to the nukes, due to the high hydro, also the low demand that hasn't recovered for the COVID. So that's absolutely a need for France to export all the power towards, of course, Italy, Switzerland, the UK, and also Spain, and a bit also to Belgium and Germany. So at the moment, France is the cheapest country all over Europe, so it needs to absolutely spread this cheap power all across Europe, and that's going to continue as much as possible despite those curbs.
And I'm sure that's much welcomed by France's neighbours across Europe. But, you know, we're here to talk about these export curbs announced by the French grid operator RTE. But Frank, can I turn to you and ask, you know, why were these put in place? What are the main reasons for the export restrictions?
From what I saw from the announcements, there is a larger than normal, historically speaking, export flow also from Spain through France towards its eastern neighbors, which puts quite a strain on the grid, more than normally. They have several planned and unplanned outages, and that all together puts quite a strain on the grid. And apparently, according to RTE calculations, it is then needed to curb its export capacities. I think it's good to stress that RTE is not unique in that, as in that every TSO does daily calculations on the import and export capacities. This is also coordinated within the region, and curbs, small and large, can be a daily occurrence. The only special thing here is that the curbs are quite large for a quite longer period of time.
And when were these curbs put in place?
They started beginning of spring this year, if I remember correctly.
March?
Yeah, March indeed. So really early spring. And then they stopped for the high summer months, and now that we are slowly rolling into the end of summer, they are coming back, which they already announced last time when they announced the curbs, and they expect it to be necessary for a while. and that is highly likely to be tied to their schedule of plant outages, of course, and then the forecast that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Frank. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that there's as Clement said, there are several factors within France, as in oversupply, high renewables, high hydro, nuclear, low demand, but it's also the Spanish imports, with their massive amounts of solar production that are being imported into France that need to go beyond France's borders. So that's also a factor here, right?
Yeah. They very specifically point to what we call transit flows. So that is a flow from zone A through B to C. And in this case, they pointed out that there's quite some transit also from Spain, but also, for example, from Belgium through France to Italy is also a thing, which makes sense because historically speaking, Italy North has always been a sink. So the Italy North cannot produce enough on its own, so imports a lot, has done so for years, and that attracts these transit flows through its neighbors, including France, but also, for example, Austria.
So this has been done. This is quite common practice and is done by other TSOs across Europe. It's a common occurrence when you have these levels of pressure on the grids coming from, especially from renewables production, or as Clement said, oversupply in a way.
Yeah, and you have to imagine that TSOs are the guardians of the grid, and of course they want to facilitate the market as much as possible, but the safety of the grid comes first, obviously. So it's not like that that as TSOs, I sometimes feel that people think that we're here in the office like, today I don't have a good mood and I will curb the borders. That's not how it works. So we have very extensive processes which are coordinated in the core region, and we publish about that a lot. And the only special thing is that they now do it for quite some time, for a longer period. But this has always been published, has always been quite transparent. The only criticism that was there at the beginning, which I agree with, is that they were a bit late explaining that they expected this to take a while. Instead from like a daily occurrence.
We'll come back to the issues of transparency here when I'll bring in Muriel and Clement there, Frank. But yeah, I mean, you're right. If the lights go out, the TSOs are the first ones up against the wall. So I think obviously you have the guardians of the security of the network. But Clement, if I can bring you in here and ask you, according to some calculations, how much has been cut so far? Do we have any indication of numbers?
We do. For the moment, it's more or less 1 gig cut with Italy and 400 megs with Switzerland, which is in fact not so bad, not so important. And especially if I extended a bit the time comparison, and if we check and we compare the numbers, the current available export toward Italy and Switzerland, for instance, compared with last year, we just noticed that we are more or less at the same level. So, at the moment, we speak a lot about it, but when you unzoom a bit and you look at longer horizon in the past, you see that the situation is absolutely not abnormal for the season, for the beginning of August. So I would say for the moment, nothing really major. We will see that after the holidays, but for the moment, for me, nothing major.
So that hasn't had a major impact on the market so far in terms of flows?
In terms of flows, overall, not so much. For Italy, I would assume that yes, 1 gig missing of import for the north of Italy, that can be a bit a major issue. But overall, at the French level, let's say, from a French perspective, not that much, especially when you see the increase also available to export towards Spain, because at the moment France export towards Spain. So once we will have the situation that Frank described, the transit flow from Spain to for instance Germany and so on, that the power curve might be much more important. But at the moment it's not so major issue. And to also come back on your price impact, it's funny to see that when the announcement was done on the 24th of July, just after that the price of the French contract of September just crashed from 49 to 39 euros per megawatt hour. Since then it's rising again, but you see that at least in France there was a clear price reaction just after that announcement. That is now gone because the contract's right now at 61 euros. So
okay, and how about with what about Italy? I mean, this is, you say 1 gigawatt missing into imports into Italy. That's obviously going to have a price effect there, right?
Yeah, there was a kind of price reaction, but a bit later. We see a price rise, but only starting on the 29th of July, so a bit later than the announcement of RTE. And since then, it's a constant rise indeed for in the Italian price for September, especially 108 to 120 euros more or less yesterday at the closing. So,
And
Yeah, I think it's good to stress that that is indeed logical for the price to crash, because sometimes people find that counterintuitive. But if you can't export and you have a lot of cheap power, like France, then indeed it makes sense that your price goes down. And if you can export, your price goes up. So that makes sense. But in the end, your welfare will definitely be impacted. So the welfare that you get from the day ahead market, in the end, will be lower because you have less exports than you could have done.
French consumers will be fairly happy there, maybe not the producers. But Muriel, if I can bring you in here. I mean, you as our France correspondent, you talk to a lot of people in the market. What has been the reaction to these limitations on power exports?
Well, yes, so the market was informed on 17th of April through a note published on the GEO platform. But some traders expressed surprise and anger because they were caught by surprise. And also, they hadn't seen it coming at all. One of the points that was raised by some traders, I'm being careful here because it's only some traders, but some felt the information had been known the day before and they had seen some movement on the markets. But in any case, what happened was that traders basically expressed a general lack of confidence towards RTE because there was a meeting on May 22nd. I think Clement took part in that meeting. It was a meeting from RTE to the market participants to try and explain the causes of the problems and also to try and explain what would happen in the future. So the participants felt that RTE was unable to properly explain what had happened. Therefore, this is creating some uncertainty in the marketplace because they feel they can't project well in the future whether this is going to repeat or not. So at the moment, traders are saying that because they're not able to rule out a similar scenario during the same period next year, they're taking these potential curbs into the power price for Q2 and Q3 of 2025. So basically, surprise and anger and lack of confidence in general towards RTE, which hasn't been able to be very, very clear about the situation.
I mean, I'd just like to make clear, I think, we have asked RTE to explain. I mean, I know you guys on the Montel News team do that regularly, but they haven't got back to us on this issue anyway, and for an invitation to be on the pod. But Muriel, some traders, I don't know whether this is anecdotal, whether this is true or not, but say, there's millions of euros that have been lost here.
There's one trader in particular who said that, yes, that he said he wasn't referring to himself, but he was referring to other traders that had told him that there'd been a lot of money lost. I mean, we know that, in these kind of situations, some people win, some people lose. If you don't want to lose money, then you shouldn't be a trader. But it's true to say that there was RT did publish these cuts, but they didn't give a global information for a couple of weeks. So if you had been looking properly at the GEO website, then you would have seen what was going on. But, there wasn't a clear explanation with proper statement that came later. But the reality is they did inform the market. There was no transparency problem. There's possibly a lack of explanation, but they did inform the market on the cuts as they were happening.
And that's a very common problem. So we have a highly complicated system, especially with the coordinated flow-based capacity calculation. And a lot of times I have the feeling that when people get really mad, they usually don't understand, or they don't understand how it works. And also in that session, because I was also in there, you could hear sometimes questions like you didn't publish. Yeah, they did. There's a daily publication tool, but people don't always know that or don't always look at it. And that makes it a bit difficult, because I think you can have fair criticism of RTE, but that sometimes gets drowned out by a lot of uninformed parties.
I know. I mean, we have to be a bit careful here because none of these numbers have been verified in terms of gains or losses, and it's anecdotal. And obviously, it's hearsay. People talking their own hearsay. People talking their own book. But Frank, I mean, in terms of transparency, do you think the information could have been put out there differently or in a more efficient, clear way? I mean, Muriel, you mentioned the JO platform, which is the Joint Allocation Office, which is a place, a sort of centralized place where basically capacity is announced or calculated. The calculations are published.
Yeah. So, like I said, so the daily publications were fine. That was always clear, both for the core region and for specifically Italy, North, and Swiss. But the fact that it was special and that they expected it to be for a longer period, that message came out a little bit late. That could have been slightly early, and I know that they have acknowledged that as well, and that's why they now publish these more extensive explanations. So yeah, to me, except for maybe that 2-week period that they could have said something a little bit earlier, but they were very busy with solving the problem. To me, I don't see a problem. What I do see is what I just mentioned, is that there is a more general issue that we have very highly complex systems, and that as the whole group of TSOs, we need to keep working on informing stakeholders for that. And this is also a thing in other regions. So the Nordics will switch to a different capacity calculation. And you see in a lot of the meetings about that people don't understand, and that we have to keep explaining to them how it works and where it's published. But in terms of what they did, I don't really see how you could do it much different, to be honest.
Fair enough. I know you're not a spokesman for RT, but you're a representative of TSOs there. So that's important information there, Frank. Thank you. Clement, what's your view here? You're also present at this meeting.
Yeah, indeed. I feel that also, even if they kind of anticipated, RT was kind of caught by the size of the issue they had to face. They knew that they had a lot of maintenance, and basically the heart of the issue is around the Lyon area, when there are a lot of maintenance on the transmission line and so on, maintenance that are needed and for the future of the grid. So those maintenance have to happen. They knew that the situation would have been tight, but not maybe as tight as it was, and they were indeed in looking for some solutions for it. So on that, they were publishing in due time by the law, if I can use those words. They respected all the codes, all the deadlines they had to warn the market. I would be a bit more harsh toward also the market, because honestly, those maintenance, if you read and you follow carefully what RTE says for years, you know that they will have to do those kind of maintenance, and that's placing the grid a bit at risk. So you can think that something is happening. As Frank said, if you follow everything which is kind of your job, you know that you can have a risk around there. And that was for the past event in the spring, and for what's happening right now. The situation on the flows, okay, they warned a bit in advance. The market reacted, also the prices reacted. But when you really look at the figures for the moment, the situation is extremely comparable to what happened last year in August and the year or so before, in terms of availability of export and so on. So what we could say, RT could bring more transparency also. They could say something like, okay, to make sure that the grid will not be at risk, we cut by default all the exports at a certain threshold. That can be the 8 gig exports maximum all day for the next two months. That would be a very nice way to anticipate everything, but that would be completely against the whole market, because that would reduce at the maximum the exports, which is nobody wants that, basically. So they need to reevaluate on a daily basis to propose as much capacity as possible. So you need to accept this uncertainty to make sure that the amount of exports are maximized. Otherwise, they just reduce at the lowest possible, and to say, okay, we are safe, and you have the transparency, you can anticipate, but do you really want that? I'm not sure.
But these, as has been mentioned here, we're in a world where you have a lot of renewable generation. You have this kind of the French nuclear output at very high levels. So there's always going to be an element of flexibility and of volatility, of course, in terms of both production and power exports. But Muriel, what has been the regulatory response, especially in France's neighbours? Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, so Belgium's energy regulator, Craig, that was back in April, called for a joint French-Belgium probe, so with Francis Creux, into those curbs. They said at the time that too little information was known by Craig and by market players on the underlying reasons behind those capacity reductions. So we haven't heard back from the result of that probe. We're waiting. But in any case, as Frank and Clement were pointing out, they changed the way they communicated. After the 17th of April, we had much more regular updates. And I think it was the updates were quite clear as well. So that they have taken heed of the criticism in any case.
Yeah, that was the main criticism, I think, from Craig. Their main criticism was clearly, please talk more. I don't think they ever questioned the legality that RTE that does those cuts. It's purely like, talk a bit about it more.
No. It really was it really was about too little information were the words used by the Craig. But the underlying question that we're hearing now a lot is, is this structural? Are we in a new era where we're going to see that every year? There's been a major shift in France with more solar. We added 4 gigawatts in the past 12 months. We have dwindling domestic demand, as Clement was pointing out, minus 8% since the energy crisis. So, and on the other hand, we also have big changes with Germany shutting down lignite and coal over the last 2-3 years, and nukes closing. We know there's 100 billion euros planned for upgrading RTEs, to update the grid to incorporate new productions. So we know there's going to be works. So does this mean that during these spring, summer months, we're going to see every year these kind of cuts? I guess that's an important question.
Absolutely, and very much so, and that needs to be brought to the fore, I think, Muriel. But before I go to the sort of outlook going forward and whether there are more structural issues at play here, Frank, could I put to you what has been the reaction in the Netherlands and perhaps I know Tennet is also active, obviously it's a German TSO as well. What has been the reaction there?
I think at first it was rather similar to the Craig. So we understand that you do it, especially as a TSO ourselves, but it would be nice if you explain a bit more. And of course, internal communication is always faster in that way. So we got quite fast a dedicated, extensive response from RTE on questions. And as far as I'm concerned, that was it. We would like to understand, and they explained, and then for us it's we don't push that further, because again we all do it. So we all need to take measures to safeguard the grid, to do capacity cuts. We all try to do it in the least amount possible, but sometimes it's unavoidable.
Yeah. And do you think in terms of structural issues at play, I mean, in the Netherlands, of course, the massive boom of solar has created, very, very many issues on the French, on the Dutch grid, both distribution and transmission level. So do you think there is a structural issue at play here? We should be thinking more about strengthening grids or using them in a more flexible way. I mean, finding different ways to optimize the production that we have.
Yeah, especially those first parts, but that's something that we are really pushing forward on. So grid investments are on an all-time high, but there is kind of a physical limit to how fast you can roll out things, and those limits we are really pushing against now. In terms of smarter market dispatch, I think that the SDAC region, the day-ahead market, is already highly efficient with how Euphemia, the market algorithm, works. I always bore my friends to death by calling it the modern world wonder in terms of what it all does and calculates. What can be looked at and what is being looked at is certain subsidies for renewables. So we are now transitioning to a maturity phase in which you can question whether all subsidies are still needed. And that's also a discussion in the Netherlands, where we have a subsidy for solar that you can basically equalize the amount of solar energy that you put in against your load, even if it's not at the same time, which is a form of subsidy because in reality it's not at the same time, so somebody needs to pay for the generation for that. And that was so successful that there are now questions of trying to abolish the subsidy because we have so much solar that it's almost pushing the system to its limits. So those are discussions that need to be had and are also being done now. But yeah, of course we need more grid investments, but that's really that has been on the forefront for years now, and it's being pushed really hard. The figures are enormous.
Yeah, it's quite tricky, isn't it, with the subsidies, because you don't want to put the brakes on fully. You want to keep encouraging the rollout of renewables, but you can't basically just have willy-nilly with no market signals.
Yeah. Personally, I think it would be okay if the brake was put on solar in the Netherlands because we have such a ridiculous amount of it, and that's great. But I don't think we need more, at least not until the load becomes more flexible. That we have more storage. We have incoming more offshore wind, which will also cause more feed-in. So, yeah, that's
fair enough. And Clement, just to round off with you, really, about the outlook for the autumn and the months that Muriel mentioned for next year. What are your expectations here? Is this going to be a recurring issue?
I would not be surprised if that's continuing to happen. Indeed, it was stated by several LT's reports, and as Frank said, the grid investments are at a record high, and especially in France because the grid is historically organized toward the nuke power plants, and now it has to be a bit more organized toward a bit more wind, especially the offshore wind that is developing finally, and so that's causing complete change of the routing of the power toward France. Historically speaking, that was more pushing the power toward Paris in some ways, and now it's gonna be more also from west to east, which is kind of the issue from having this pass through from Spain to Italy or from Spain to Germany. Which is historically speaking was more the opposite way around, because in the west of France there is not so much power that are produced. It's more around the Rhone or on the Loire, but not so much. While now in the Brittany, the offshore wind is coming. So you need to kind of reverse completely the way the grid was built, and you don't make it in a day.
And market participants, need to be keeping an eye on these information platforms very closely in order to get hold of the latest information, right?
And speaking of that, what we can eventually regret on the transparency point, that all the grids need to publish the maintenance of the cross-border lines, but they are not necessarily obliged to publish the maintenance of the internal line, and that's something that we could ask for a bit more transparency, publication, a bit more organized, let's say, because I'm not saying it's not published, I'm saying it's not as organized as it is for it's not on the remit publication basically. So that might be a question to open, but yeah, is it really needed?
Perfect, Clement. We'll finish on that. In the interest of time, we'll finish on that plea for more internal grid transparency. But thank you, Clement, Frank, and Muriel, for an excellent discussion on this somewhat contentious issue. And thank you for making it very clear and providing your insights. Thank you.